flow process these days, and we want to try to make sure we make it the best process possible, right? So, full disclaimer, I am not a developer. I come from a design background where I taught myself how to do HTML and CSS, and that's about as much development as you'll get out of me. But I've been in the weeds with a lot of developers throughout the years, building websites and working alongside with them, figuring out how they work just as much as how I work as a designer. And together we came up with this system of how we can make sure that everybody is kind of moving together collaboratively to make a successful project. So a little bit more about me. I currently work at Hope 42, and I am a senior UX designer there. And you can find me all over the internet. For the sake of this talk, you can find me contributing to admin UI efforts for the Drupal community, as well as out in Twitter. And if you didn't hear earlier, I actually traveled from Ocean City, Maryland, so I drove up here to talk with all of you guys today, and I hope that you guys had safe travels as well. So to kind of give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to make some promises, right? And we're going to hold those promises true. We're going to talk about how development teams can work with design teams in the design process, and then how the opposite will happen, and the designers should be involved in the development process. And I can see you all rolling your eyes already. Trust me, it's worth it. As long as we're all talking, it's going to be great. And then we're going to talk about what happens right before the website goes live, and then how we're going to implement all of these crazy ideas that I'm putting in front of you today. So the first promise I want to make to you is kind of a long one. And that, basically, to sum it up, is we should always be validating what we do with each other and not going off and making these crazy promises to clients, saying that we're going to do these things, and then the development team is like, what the heck? So say it with me. I promise to include development from beginning to end. Come on. Perfect. Love it. You guys are doing great. And the second, on the reverse, from developers, right? We should be including the design team in the review process, right? The QA, the builds. You are going to love me for this, right? You want to hear all those little things that the designers are like, hey, I want to tweak that. But it's a little bit more detailed than that, I promise. So, say it with me. I promise to include design from beginning to end. All right. So, let's get to collaborating. What are the goals of this process? The goals are to make sure that we keep design recommendations on track and keep them within the development scope. We want to make sure that our project expectations are realistic for our clients as well as for our internal efforts. We want to make sure that everyone is always informed to minimize the surprises throughout the project, and making sure that we can find bugs earlier, maybe in a wireframe, instead of when we start to build it out and realize that these things aren't working. So to go over from the design phase, right, we have 3 high-level areas of design: the design research, the wireframes, and the actual design itself. So throughout these processes, we need to make sure that we're all talking to each other. And this is just a really small representation of what I'm talking about here. So you're looking at this and you're thinking, holy crap, that's like a lot of arrows, that's a lot of moving pieces. What are we going to do? How do you do this efficiently? It's important that we understand that there is a concept as such as too many cooks in the kitchen, right? We have a budget, we need to stick with it. So in order for the developers to have a say in the design process and to make their project a little bit smooth, we're going to do designated development champion. And that means we're going to take one developer who can give some insights into scoping and functionality and be a person that can say to a designer, we need to think about this differently. And we don't need to have an entire team of people in that process to do it, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the developer that's working on the project in the end. It just needs to be someone that can bring a different perspective into the design project. So, back to these circles. The design research is where we're not really delivering too many crazy things to a client yet, right? We're going to go look at a competitive landscape. We're going to say, this is what other people are doing, and these are our findings. but there is usually something tangible that comes out of this, and that's a mood board. Clients will sometimes give feedback on that, and then you don't necessarily need to go to the developer here, but it just really depends on how that conversation is going already. You might have a client telling you that they want these crazy features just based off of a mood board, and you don't want to say, absolutely, we can do that. You want to say, let me talk to my developers first. We're still pushing them, to make these decisions a little bit later, but ultimately the research, when you present to a client from the very beginning, can set you up for some problems if you're not including developers in this conversation early on. So, we've resolved the mood boards, the research, and now we're into wireframes. This is where we're putting the physical pieces of the puzzle together, and we're starting to take components and structuring them and putting them together with templates, and we're creating this solidified outline to give a client, right? But before we do that, we want to take this internal. We want to maybe do a little bit of a sketch on a whiteboard, right? It doesn't have to be anything crazy, but you want to show it to a developer. You want to make sure that someone, again, can put eyes on it that can provide a different perspective than a designer can. So the designer's like super excited because they're like, heck yeah, I'm going to have this big hero in the background, and the developer's like, well, is it an image? Is it a video? Does it do all these crazy things? Like, they're going to ask questions that you might not even be thinking about yet. And the client's going to ask you that question, and you need to be prepared to answer it, right? So there are things that the developers are going to provide in these phases that are preparing you to set yourself up for success with the clients. And lastly, the best part of all is the design phase. And this is the part where we're going to make all the magic happen, right? And this is the part where we can also, once again, accidentally make a lot of false promises to a client. And we're trying to avoid this, right? So when we're making decisions about how things are interacting, we need to make sure, again, that we're not getting overly ambitious. And this is where we start to get tension, right? Developers are like, your design is absolutely crazy. And designers are like, but why? And that's all it takes, right? The why. You need to ask questions, and you need to make sure that they're not just saying that because they're like, crap, that looks like a lot of work, and I don't want to do that, right? You want to make sure that the reason that they're having that reaction is because it's actually limiting to what they need to do in the overall scope of the project. So between the wireframes and the designs is probably where you're going to have the majority of this push and pull internally as well as with the clients. And we just want to make sure that before we send something to a client, we're going through our internal resources as well. So now you're asking, well, do I really need to show the developer every single thing? And what if the client has like 18 rounds of feedback? That's just an absurd thing to think about. Sometimes the client's going to tell you, I don't like that font. I need you to make that logo bigger. You don't need to run that by a developer, right? So there are strategic ways to think about when you need to ask a developer something and when you don't. And there's liberties there where, you're going to say, I really don't need to show the developer this because they have other stuff to worry about, and that's okay. But the point is, you just need to understand when the value that the developer has is going to be important to the end result. Now, with that being said, that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear your beloved opinions about the design. So, developers typically don't get to have opinions about what design looks like. And a lot of times I feel, as a designer, that that's limiting. And the reason that that's limiting is because not only are they the ones that are in the weeds building it, but they've seen a lot of stuff too. They should know, because they were in the research with you and they were in the wireframe with you, what the goals of the project are. They should be able to bounce ideas off of you and say, maybe this is a better option. We don't want to hold you back from that. But the point is that you need to make sure the feedback that you're getting is critical, and the feedback that you're getting is going to be a more productive result to the client's end goals. So we're not saying, you can only tell me that that's not functional. That's not the case. It's great to have more people giving their opinions. So, we've gone through the fancy stuff, and now we're going to get to the technical stuff. What happens after the design is completed? You're going to hand it off to a developer. So this project is your baby, right? the project has been so near and dear to you, so close to your heart, and you're super excited about how it's all panned out. You can't wait to see it when it's live. So you just give it to a developer and walk away, right? That's logical. Of course that's what you want to do. You don't want to talk to them about any of it. You don't want to tell them how to take care of that baby. You just want to give it to them and hope for the best. Wrong. So an official handoff is super important because your one primary point of contact is now becoming a group. And you're going to take a step back, but in order to do that, you need to let the whole group understand what you were thinking. Only one person knows this on your team right now, right? That's one developer. So they're going to ask questions, and you need to answer them. It's pretty simple, right? That's a pretty straightforward logic. But sometimes also there are things that change from the last client iteration to the developer handoff that even that one developer didn't get any say in. And they're thinking to yourself, well, why not? Weren't they supposed to have a say in all of that? Sometimes, and I can hear you loud and clear, project manager Stacy out there, you don't have a say in how fast you get to turn around stuff sometimes. And you have a developer that's 80 hours into a 40-hour week on a project, and your client wanted this thing yesterday. You've already worked together so much and so closely that you should have an idea of whether or not that developer is going to approve of this change, right? But they still might not understand, well, that's not the last thing I saw. What's going on here? So you need to talk about it. The less confusion there is, the quicker the build's going to go. Plain and simple. So what does a developer handoff usually look like? Well, for us, it's usually a 1 to 2 hour meeting that has, again, the entire team there from front-end developers to back-end developers. And I'm going to present it to you like I'm a client. I'm going to tell you this is exactly how these things go. And then you're going, again, to be critical with me, and you're going to ask me questions about how things function, because we're not necessarily going to be able to lay out from A to B on this one mock-up how things are moving or how things work together. Like, what if that component lives somewhere else? Like, those are all questions that you don't get from a static file, right? And after that, you're going to start to set a schedule for client expectations, right? Normally they want to see like a homepage first, and then you develop a set of priorities based off of like components or templates after that. And you work together to figure out the high-level items that are must-haves, and then figure out like how fast that needs to happen and all of these things. And then the design team can figure out how you need to plan accordingly. Like, maybe I don't need to review for another 2 weeks because you're just going to be focusing on back-end stuff for the beginning of this project. Those kinds of things are where you will start to set priorities and timelines. So then the development begins. So what happens when the developer starts writing all their fancy code and the designer is sitting in front of their computer? What happens? Well, normally what happens in my experience is nothing. A designer is going to be sitting there waiting to see something, and then out of nowhere, there's 2 weeks that have gone by, and you're like, wow, I really wish I would have saw what you did there. That looks pretty cool. But we're not going to do that anymore. So basically what we want to do is have a design QA. And as pieces of front-end development items, or pieces of front-end items begin to be built, the designer can then start to be involved in the QA process. And this isn't like, take a look at the whole website really quick and tell me what you think. This is, as you're going through your tickets, you're going to assign them to a design QA just as you would to a development QA. And designers usually get a little bit more nitpicky than a development QA would be, right? So we're out there with the magnifying glass, like, that's 2 pixels smaller than it should be. And we know that's not the kind of feedback that you want. So we're trying to make sure that when we're doing this, though, that we're doing it for a purpose, and it's not like the 2 pixels might not matter, right? It shouldn't, that's not exactly what we're looking for. We're looking to make sure that, the fonts that we're using are the right fonts, or that the hover state's actually working the way we wanted it to, or some other things that maybe weren't necessarily in your prototype, but the developer had to build for, right? And then we're making sure that we are also, providing a fix. We're making notes, and then we're providing a solution to that. So, you need time for design QA. Plain and simple. Who's ever been on a project that's had design QA assigned to them in the development project? That's what I thought. Hey, look, one, you're a lucky guy. So design QA is something that I'm a strong advocate for because it's something that is never in a budget, but it always should be in the budget, right? You need someone to look at it from the promises you made to a client visually, make sure we're following through with that. And we're not just going to say, look, I clicked on this thing and it didn't do anything. The client is just as in love with the visual design as we are, so we need to make sure that their expectations are being met. So how do we do it? You're probably familiar with the cycle of a development task being completed. You assign it to QA. And then from there, you kind of make your steps for, is there an issue, is there not an issue, can we push it, blah, blah, blah. But what you might not be implementing, as we determine, is where the design review comes in this process. So, this is the no-brainer. Development QA should sign off on all items before seen by a client. But wait, we forgot about design. Again, this is how we fix it. So the front-end task is completed, and then we ship it to the dev QA, right? They're going to check to make sure that nothing is broken or you didn't break anything else when you made it, right? And it all looks good. We're clear. We're going to assign it to the design QA. And the design QA is going to do the same thing the development QA does. We're just going to check to make sure it all looks right and it's working. And we're going to say, if there's an issue, ship it back to the front-end developer. And then if the front-end developer can determine here, well, how drastic was that change, right? Was it something that requires a development review again? Or maybe we can just go back to design review. So those are the things that we kind of have to think about too, is the requests that we're changing or making for a design bug. It might have some functionality associations with it as well. So then we got to go back into that QA workflow where developers and designers are checking side by side to make sure that all the stuff is running smoothly. So, design QA should sign off on all items before seen by a client. Now we have both the development QA and the design QA giving it a thumbs up before it goes out. Perfect. What happens after the design QA has the functionality requirements changing? And this is also something that is not necessarily a design QA, but a client request change too, right? So these two things kind of go hand in hand. And I kind of just spoke about this a little bit, but what happens then when, this is the craziest chart of all. What happens when maybe a client says, design QA looks off, but it's because I want it to do something totally different now. Well, if there's budget for it, that's the first concern, right? But then we decide, yeah, that's fixable, so how do we do it? And the design will, make their recommendations and give it to development QA. And then from there, we just repeat this cycle. That's all we're doing, right? We're just repeating cycles. And the design team is talking to the development team, and then we're taking those changes and we're making sure that all of this stuff is actually going smoothly. So we're not here to judge your efficiency, your competency, nothing like that. We just want to make sure that what we're promising, again, is being fully represented when the final product goes out the door. So what we do after we've done all the little pieces is we go through a bunch of fine-tuning up until this point, right? So we've been looking at a single component that's being built. And maybe now we've got a whole page layout. But we still didn't look at maybe how those pages are interacting. So we're going to do the one last full site QA before we ship it out the door. And what are we looking for when we're doing that? So we're looking for bugs in the existing behavior and performance of the website, right? We're not going to do anything crazy here. This is not where we're requesting to make new enhancements. We're not changing functionality. We simply need to make sure that this last spot check is good to go. So sometimes it also gets a little bit chaotic when we're doing all this QA, right? And we need to make sure that we're following through and making sure that everything that we have asked to be updated is actually being updated. So we need to make sure that there's one last pair of eyes that's making that happen before it goes out the door. So we're going to set some expectations here. Right now, all of us are on cloud 9, right? We're all super happy. We're working together so seamlessly, and none of us have had a single argument throughout this whole project, right? Because we've been including each other from start to finish. But did anyone actually think about how we're going to do this? I mean, yeah, we can talk to each other a little bit here and there, but isn't that like a lot of time for everyone that we didn't think about before? So the first step is to plan accordingly. And of course this is like common sense, right? You're like, well, I have this idea and now I need to make it happen. Where do we start this? And most of us in this room probably don't even have a say in where this starts, because it should start in the sales process. And from there, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we need to make sure that whoever our representative is to advocate for procedural updates and changes is aware that maybe we're not using the right method right now, right? And what is the level of effort that it takes to get the job done? So having the expectation set up front that another person is maybe going to be needed throughout the design process is pretty important. If no one knows that you need another person, how are they going to give you the time for that other person to be there for you? So we're just trying to make sure that we can eliminate as many contentions as possible, because trying to cram another person into a project phase that only has 40 hours anyway is never going to work, right? Now, I know you're thinking, Lindsay, that was a lot of QA, like a lot. And it kind of was, right? There's a lot of people that need to feel like they checked it before it went out the door, right? We just need to make sure that we are setting the expectations during the QA process of what the designer is actually going to be doing. And what that is comparing requirements from the original handoff and then making sure that those requirements are being met. The disruption comes in when the client obviously has some change requests, right? But for the most part, during QA, we're not here to say, I need you to redo this entire thing. What we need to do is to make sure that it's all accurate based off of what we talked about. So the other thing that I do want to kind of put some emphasis on is that design iterations should be flexible. And designers, I hear you, you're like, why? I made it this way and I want it to be that way. Well, sometimes it just doesn't happen that way. And the reason why it doesn't happen that way hopefully have been eliminated because we've been talking with developers, but sometimes we run into some unexpected roadblocks with something we're trying to implement, and then we start to run out of time. So what we need to do is prioritize the bugs that we're finding based on what's super important and then what's nice to have. And again, it's because there's things that are unpredictable that we can't necessarily account for, and we need to make sure that there's some give and pull on our side just as much as there is on the development side, or as much as there is on even like the strategy side of things and the content side of things. Like everyone has to have some kind of compromise, right? So to keep it simple, there isn't too much QA when you have design involved, but we need to make sure that we're being purposeful when we are making those QA updates. So I'm going to mention this one again because it's super important. QA and fixing the bugs that we're finding takes time. But it doesn't just take time at the end of the project. Make sure that there is time for developers in the beginning, and make sure that we are adding it to our project plans, right? Oftentimes, designers are just sitting there at the very end thinking, well, I hope it works, right? This is cool. Yeah, we don't want that. We want to make sure that everybody is able to spend a quality amount of time in the project looking at things, right? We need time to fix it. Let me repeat that. We need time to fix the bugs. So it's, again, one of those things where we start to maybe hit some roadblocks and some things didn't get implemented the way we wanted them to, but we need to fix it. And we need to make sure that we're not taking up all of that time in the beginning where we're saying, well, I have this much time to build it, and I think that's exactly what we can do. But what about the extended chunk of time that we didn't think about, where we were going to maybe run into a few hurdles, or we were going to need to figure out that, this thing that we're using didn't even work in this program that we're programming for, right? So we, as developers, usually get a little bit more time to think about, hey, there's going to be some bugs, we need to fix it. But designers also need that time in the QA process and in the development process, right? But since I'm not a wizard and I can't just wave my magic wand and things will be updated, there's time that needs to be required, or that needs to be allocated for those things. It would be pretty sweet if I was a wizard, but unfortunately, not the case. So, the same goes for developers during the design process, right? I know this, I've been saying this over and over, but you can't get out of it, right? Even if you want to, you can't. You're stuck with me from the very beginning, and you just gotta work with me. No, I'm kidding. You would love to work with me, right? But basically, what I'm trying to get at is you need to talk to each other. And we need to make sure that we have time to talk to each other. Time to talk to each other takes valuable minutes out of a project that I could be working on something if there isn't a budget for it. So just as much as designers aren't seen as being useful in the development build, developers are also getting this notion that, they're not useful in the beginning of a project. And the case is, you are. We need you. You need us. That's how it works. So, collabs make the best products, right? It's not hard for designers and developers to get along. We just need to all come together and understand how each of us works. Do I need to know how to build that custom JavaScript thing? No. Do I need to know that that is something that's time intensive? Yeah, I do. And once we open up and let each other into our processes, we can figure out a way to kind of be a little bit more predictive, right? I can be familiar with how the developer is working, so that way I can say, well, actually, I think before I even get into my design file, I think that's going to take a lot of time. And maybe I should talk to them first before I do it. The most important thing is that we're all involved from beginning to end. There will be a more cohesive and organized and just ultimately a more functional end product as a result of all of this, right? The more minds that you have coming together with different perspectives, the better the discussion is. I would love to have, content strategists give me design feedback, but it needs to be constructive criticism, right? You need to ask them, why are you giving me this feedback? Just like we were hearing earlier. The why is really important. So the more pain points that you can resolve from the beginning by having different people that aren't experts in that portion of the project are going to be really beneficial to how the whole thing comes together in the end. And with that, I'm a little early. I've sped talk through some of that, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to shout it out. Yeah.
So before our designers are involved, we have a pretty long func speccing process.
Okay.
I wonder, well, first of all, when you say design, are you referring to like design and UX?
Well, so from my perspective, I'm talking about design. What's that?
Can you repeat the question for the recording?
Oh, sorry, yes. The question was, when I'm speaking about design, am I talking about design and UX? And in this case, I am. But there are definitely teams that have UX strategists that are separate from the design team, and I've been in those environments as well. And typically, it's just as important to have a developer there, and as it is a designer. A lot of times designers aren't even talking to strategists in that phase of the project, right? And that's why we need to talk about it from the beginning, because people are like, well, now you want a designer and a developer talking to my strategist, and that's 2 extra people for this meeting with this client, and things start to get a little bit hectic. And it's setting expectations too, that maybe they don't all need to talk to the client, but I still need to have 20 minutes where internally we can all look at this thing together. So the designer isn't like handed some wireframe, like, well, what is this? You know? Yep.
There were a couple things that I saw. So the circles you had earlier up with the feedback with developers and clients at the different stages. I'm wondering if is there more of an order to consulting with the developer before showing it to a client? Because once the client sees something and they really like it, then it becomes locked in stone. And it's like, okay, now the developer is forced to have to do it. So there wasn't really a point in consulting with the developer at that point.
Right. Let me go back.
Repeat the question.
Yes. So that's okay. So the question was, and hope I'm summing it up right.
In all this.
Yeah, is that making sure that developer is getting the feedback before it goes to the client, right?
Yeah.
And that is the point that I'm trying to hit home with this cycle, is that the designer's going to make something, then they're going to show it to a developer. The client hasn't even heard from me yet. And usually the designer makes something and they say, creative director, look at this, or maybe the strategist, look at this, make sure it's right. But this is where the disconnect usually happens, is the developer isn't involved in that conversation, and they should be.
Right.
So ultimately, that would be the right way to do it, is to have the developer giving you feedback, or giving the design team feedback before the client even has any eyes on it at all. So we're not making those false promises. And we can also run into issues where clients are like, you're on a call with a client as a designer giving the presentation, but the developer's not there. And the client's like, well, what if it does that? Wouldn't it be really cool if it does that? And the designer's like, heck yeah, that would be really cool, let's do it. That's the wrong answer. The right answer is, that would be really cool, let me talk to my developers first, right? So we need to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up internally for failure because the client thought of some crazy idea that they just like pulled out of left field, and you were like, wow, that's actually an incredible idea, I really like that. So yeah, making sure that the developers are in on it before we set false expectations is definitely really important to all of this working right.
The second question I had was, you mentioned when not to include a developer in sometimes simple things. I would say, even in that case, you probably want to inform them. It's like just send them a link saying, hey, I made some updates. You know, you don't have to consult with them, but at least let them know that something changed.
Right. So, yes, exactly. So the comment was that if the changes are, the client is sending back are maybe just making the logo bigger, or some like, you know, aesthetic changes that a developer doesn't need to be in on, that they don't necessarily, I said to not tell the developer at all, but what we should do is to then maybe just notify them. And I think that the reason why I'm saying that they don't need to be involved at all is because a lot of times you guys are like, development is really busy and they're like, I don't care, Lindsay, I don't care that they wanted to make the logo bigger, just do it. But documenting it somewhere like in Jira or wherever you guys are doing your ticketing is a perfect example of how everyone can stay informed throughout this whole process, but I don't need to pull you into a meeting for that, right?
We use Marvel, so it's like just send me a link to the Marvel docs. Hey, this got updated. Go take a look.
Exactly.
All right. Do that when I have free time.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm just curious to know your thoughts on going from the design research phase to wireframes using mood boards. Like what that process is like, you know, in your opinion, and what works for you, because you know our current process is like show a bunch of home pages. You know, how can a mood board help kind of go from that phase to the next?
Sure. So the question was, how does a mood board help set you up for success in the wireframe phase? And to that, I would say that when you're making the mood board, you should be mood boarding based off of like specific things, not just like an entire homepage, right? So you're mood boarding and you're saying that I like the style of this, I like the style of that, I like this font, this image, whatever. And then you're gonna start by building some kind of like component library in your wireframes. So what the first thing that you're drawn to do is build that homepage. But maybe what you want to do is say, let me just make some header options really quick, and then jump to the bottom and make some footer options, and then make another component type, and that way you can think about it in pieces instead of as one full layout. And a lot of times it's really nice to actually talk about the pieces, because that's how developers build it, right? You build it in pieces, so why not design it in pieces as well? And then you can talk in micro conversations about certain little things instead of a giant like 1 hour meeting about this like 4 different layout option thing, right? Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, how often is the client involved at that point? Like, because that can change so much. I guess the client and the developer, how often are they kind of collaborating at that stage?
So how often are the client and developer collaborating in the mood boarding?
In the mood boarding phase, right?
Yeah, so that one's the one that's like kind of a little bit of a stretch, in that usually in my experience, when you present a mood board to a client, they're like, I guess so. Like, I don't know what you're going to do with that, right? But then there are the like strategic analyzers that are like, well, why did you pick that little thing? And then that's where you start to have those accidental discussions where you're like, well, this is the functionality I was thinking and that I liked when I saw this. And that's why the feedback process needs to happen there, because you might be saying that, well, this website had this really cool like parallax scroll jacking thing that I really liked. And the client's like, oh, show me what that looks like. And then in your mood boarding, you're on other websites looking at things, and then functionality starts to come into the picture. So it's not necessarily that you're like building a collage together and clipping out little magazine things and gluing them together with each other, but you're having discussions about how pieces are moving, and that's where the developers will be really helpful. Yeah.
Is the PM involved when you go in those design and dev feedback? And at times, are they a referee?
Right. So the question was, is the PM involved in that process, and are they usually the referee? And to that, I would say always, right? The project manager is always there, lurking in the background, making sure things are working smoothly and going the way that they know the project should go. But I really just wanted to focus on the things that aren't standard right now. And it's standard to have a project manager, I would hope. They're giving oversight, but it's not necessarily standard for me to have a developer in the research phase of my project. So it's very common to have a project manager involved in those discussions, and that's why I was saying usually a designer is taking their findings and showing it to someone internally before it goes to a client. They're going to show it to a project manager, a creative director, or somebody like that, but they need to also show it to a developer too.
The other part is it hard doing the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves?
As a designer or a developer?
Everybody.
So the question was, is it hard to do the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves? And the answer to that would be always. You always want to have these really fancy things, but there's always going to be a limitation somewhere that you have to like give yourself a reality check. And you need to just make sure that you can think about it analytically instead of, personally and being like, well, this is my favorite thing and I really want to do it. And I think that it's really hard for clients to see that sometimes, right? It's really hard for them to be like, everything is a must-have. I must have it all. It's all mine. And it's just finding the way to kind of be like, take a step back, and this is how we'll figure out collaboratively what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Kind of subtle variant of a lot of people's questions and what you presented. Yours being, how do the dev and design work together? If there's a PM that actually is driving a project with the client, and the PM is just checking with dev, can we make this? Can we make this? And they're kind of flushing out all these things that are going to get built. But when is it assigned bring the designer into it.
Right. So the question was, when project managers are communicating with clients and they are getting these requests and they're just asking a developer, can we do this? Can we do that? Blah, blah, blah. When should a designer be involved in that? And the way I like to think about this is, well, one, does it change anything on the front end that we haven't already presented in like another component or a style guide or something like that? If the answer to that is yes, bring a designer in. The other thing is it changing something that is affected globally, like our navigation? Bring a designer in. If it's like the client wants to change the hover state of this button, designers want to be involved in that. But if it's for like a specific instance, like a global button style, maybe, yeah, you want to bring a designer in. But there's like this one call to action on this page, maybe not. But 9 times out of 10, if it's a client request that requires a front end change, you're going to want to bring a designer in. The designer's going to have their feelings hurt if you don't. But sometimes, like your question is alluding to, right, is like, I don't have time. That's what we're breaking it down to, right, is I don't have time. And you just need to be able, as a designer, can think like, well, I know that it takes this long for a developer to do this. I know it takes a design team this long to do that. So maybe you would already know, well, that's going to take too long for the designer to even do, for me to give them a mock-up or whatever. It depends on how the cycle is working for that phase of the project.
So to follow up, the tricky part of this is everything is component-based.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all building these little atoms, and they say, we don't need the designer yet, we're just making the search box. Pretty soon all this collection of pieces, where's that part where we bring the designer in and then wait a minute, we're way off the main design because we're stuck with these little atoms that are not going to fit the plan.
Right. So the follow-up to that was that designing in little pieces, like atomically with a search bar, is the designer required in that phase. And it's a weird interpretation in that I would say yes, if it's going to be part of a bigger picture. But if you know that it's just going to be a small thing, then and you're just maybe changing something in this one instance, the designer can review that in QA, right? So they don't necessarily need to be brought in before you make like 3 lines of CSS to make something different. And it might be smarter for you to just implement it quickly to then show it to a designer. So it really depends on the level of effort it would take both parties, and then what like impact does it have on the overall project. Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been in a happy situation where this early feedback saved the developer from having to implement 12 pixels instead of 11 pixels because that's what the comp said and you didn't really care whether it was 11 or 12 pixels?
Have I been in a situation where I'm handing off to a developer and I don't care if it's 11 or 12 pixels? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and the early feedback helped identify the fact that you didn't care.
I gotcha, yeah. The way that I collaborate with developers is that, as we were listening to in the keynote, every single way you can view a design is going to be different. So the fact that you are looking at this on, your MacBook Pro in Chrome, and you want it to be 12 pixels from the top of the page isn't going to look right on your phone. It's going to look different. So the way that I normally look at it is like, make sure that it has the good enough spatial awareness, right? Like, just make sure that it's really close. And there aren't necessarily instances where I'm ever out there like adding up pixels just because I know that the environment that it lives in is going to change what that end result looks like. So early on in the process is normally for me is like, this is what it looks like, get as close as you can, and we'll fine tune what we need to, right? Does that make sense?
So have you actually benefited from the early feedback so that the dev does not waste time trying to implement exactly what was in the mockups?
Okay. So have I ever personally implemented from the developer not being pixel perfect from the beginning? And I've never really worked with someone who has ever been pixel perfect from the very beginning. And normally that is just because, we all have our own approach to getting a first version out the door, and it doesn't necessarily need to be pixel perfect from the very beginning, in my experience. So I would say it's a huge benefit, right? Because it'll allow you to think about what you need to think about to get something in front of people first, and that first thing that you're building, though, should be in front of your internal team. It shouldn't be in front of a client. And then we can start to kind of iterate from there. So whatever the workflow is for the developer to kind of get that first thing out the door, they should be worrying about the technicalities, and then the front end stuff with the really specific stuff will follow after that.
I can sort of answer his question a little bit. I've been on projects as a developer, working with a designer. She was new to the project, and she designed some new sketches, and she used a different color of blue that was almost the same color of blue that was in the code, but it was different.
Yeah.
So if I had just simply copied her RGB values, I would have added another blue that was the same. And we had 35 different shades of that same blue in our code system when I started searching through it. Because of that lack of feedback, that the developer simply copied it verbatim every single time, and it was always off by A. A became B, or something like that, but it still rendered it the same blue.
Right.
But they were all different.
So normally in that circumstance, and what was said was that there's like 19 different shades of blue in a Photoshop file, and it should probably all be one.
Yeah, they all render the same blue.
Right, and they all like render the same. So that's a perfect example of, I hopefully can be proven wrong as a designer in that case, and the developer should take the liberty of just making them all the same if they're that close in value, right, and they're rendering the same.
We had a conversation, she said, oh yeah, I'm not actually checking, I'm just taking a
Exactly.
screenshot from the website
Yeah.
and then using what was already there. We ran into a problem, like it looked like a custom scroll bar, but she had just taken a screenshot from her Mac Chrome with that scroll bar.
Yeah.
And when you do it on Windows, the scroll bar looks different. And so we went down the route of creating a custom scroll bar. She's like, no. No, you can just use the default one and save us a ton of time.
Yeah. Cool. Did you?
Just the handoff, you said like 1 to 2 hour handoff. Do you find that it gets kind of bogged down in details? Or do you find sometimes the developers just kind of disengage, like, yep, and then like a week later, like, wait, that's a search component? We have to have a search thing?
So the question was, in the developer handoff, do I usually find that the developers are actually engaging with me versus are they just saying, thanks, Lindsay, I'll look at it later? And I've actually been in situations where I've not even had everyone that I need to talk to in my developer handoff, which is pretty detrimental to the actual build out of the website. And when I'm presenting and talking to the developers, since this is like what I'm very adamant about, I'm always making sure that I presented this whole thing, and then I'm like, how long do you think that'll take you to implement? Or what do you use to implement this? I saw this somewhere and I thought it was really cool, but I don't know how to do it. Can you tell me how to do it? So I'm asking you questions that make you answer me instead of just presenting to a brick wall. I have been in situations where I've like talked to a developer, handed off a project, and then that happened where a couple of weeks went by and then they were like, Lindsay, I have all these questions. And sometimes maybe you're disengaged because you have other things that you're working on, you're multitasking, you're not really listening, and that project isn't slated for like 2 weeks, and that makes sense. So make sure then that in that 2 weeks, we can meet again, so that way you're ready. Because maybe the back end had everything that they needed, but the front end wasn't ready to work on it, and now you have some questions. It might not be efficient, but you still would want to, meet again to talk about all of those things. But the important thing is that like the designer should be asking you questions that make you pay attention, so that way it can be a little bit more constructive in that regard.
Follow-up, do you use like Envision and expect the developer to like put comments in there so it's kind of captured, or is it kind of user?
The question was, do I use Envision and expect developers to add comments? And I'm actually a weird little bird. I am not a standard design platform tool user. I use Webflow, and I design in the browser with HTML and CSS. And that gives you something that you can inspect with code and then question me later about how I built it because it's totally inaccurate. But to kind of take a step back for people that are taking that approach, it would be great to have developers asking questions there. But the problem is now we have too many channels that we're talking in. So typically what I would do is have, like in that developer handoff, I'm in Jira with you writing tickets in that handoff. So I'm in there creating a ticket, they're walking me through how their preferred method is for all of this, and then I can help create some tickets maybe for front end later, and especially for when I'm doing the QA and all of this. So as long as there's some documentation in whatever channel that you're using to do that communicating is what's really important out of all of that.
Thanks.
Oh, and time. Perfect.